Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, let me first of all congratulate the hosts and organizers of this initiative, namely the Coordination Center for TOD-RU, and thank them for their warm welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, promoting an internet based on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law is a priority for the Council of Europe. In March 2012, our 47 member states adopted the Council of Europe's Internet Governance Strategy to protect and foster core values online. This includes doing no harm to the architecture of the Internet, protecting users from crime and insecurity, and in promoting democracy and cultural diversity. The Internet is a global resource necessitating a shared commitment to fostering its development. This includes protecting the freedom of Internet actors to provide Internet services that facilitate expression and content creation. There is a need for decisions to be shaped and supported by other actors, civil society and the private sector. In other words, by enabling multi-stakeholder dialogue to flourish as you are doing today. The Russian Federation, as you know, joined the Council of Europe in February '96 and took the necessary steps to ratify the European Convention on Human Rights. The Russian Federation, as for the 46 other member states of the Council of Europe, is therefore committed to securing to everyone within its jurisdiction the human rights and fundamental freedoms enshrined in this convention. This includes freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association, and the right to private life, online and offline. Freedom of expression lies at the heart of the free societies. It is guaranteed under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and the European Court of Human Rights has held that Article 10 also protects opinions that may, I quote, offend, shock, or disturb the state or any sector of the population. It is only in narrowly circumscribed circumstances that Article 10 can be restricted. Any interference in freedom of expression and freedom of media must indeed be prescribed by law, pursue a legitimate aim, and be necessary in a democratic society, which means responding to a pressing social need. Managing the unprecedented speed and global reach of expression of the Internet requires restraint and responsibility by refraining from acts or declarations designed to stir up hatred and confrontation. In the media and in the courts, we see how much freedom of expression on the Internet can be subject of intense controversy and extreme violence. Online video clips and social media abuse can cause anger and offense. In his 2011 report, the United Nations Special Representative, Frank LaRue, expressed his concern about the criminalization of online expression, whether through the application of existing law or the creation of special legislation concerning expression on the Internet. He noted that such laws are often justified as being necessary to protect individuals' reputation, national security, or to counter terrorism. However, in practice, these laws are frequently used to censor content that the government and other powerful entities do not like or agree with. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no freedom without security. People need to feel safe, including from offline consequences of online content. Children must be protected from abuse online, from grooming, from cyberbullying. Incitement to hatred or violence should have no place in our connecting living space. People's trust on the internet depends on combating effectively all forms of cybercrime, which can have a very serious impact on people's lives and carries with an enormous economic cost. The Council of Europe has elaborated several international legally binding conventions to protect people from crimes committed on the internet. This is one form of governance. This includes conventions for the protection of children against sexual abuse and sexual exploitation, the prevention of terrorism, and the protection of health against counterfeit medical products, our medical convention, Medicrime Convention, open to signature here in Moscow 2 years ago. Our Budapest Cybercrime Convention has become a global standard in the fight against crime. 5 states recently ratified, including Japan, as the first country in Asia. And we encourage the Russian Federation to consider to sign and ratify this important instrument to fight cybercrime. That said, regardless of the form of instrument, we have a common commitment to fighting crime on internet. In addition, there is the Council of Europe Data Protection Convention, better known as our Convention 108, which protects the automatic processing of people's personal data. It is another standard of global reference which Uruguay will accede to, making it the first non-European state to accede to it, and we hope that the Russian Federation will, as soon as possible, ratify this convention. Ladies and gentlemen, let us look ahead. For the internet to remain universal, open, and innovative, we are moving away from traditional 20th century multilateral diplomacy to the 21st century multi-stakeholder dialogue. This is the future of democratic society. This promotes transparency and trust in institutions and enhances the democratic accountability of citizens. Your dialogue is therefore essential. In looking ahead, we must ensure the internet is properly framed. In this context, I would like to draw your attention on the Council of Europe 10 Internet governance principles, which the Russian Federation and the other 46 member states adopted in 2011. These principles commit member states to, first of all, recognize international human rights law, to promote the full participation of governments, the private sector, civil society, the technical community, and users, to recognize states have rights and responsibilities, to refrain from any action that would directly or indirectly harm persons or entities outside of their territorial jurisdiction, to empower users, to recognize the free flow of internet traffic, to acknowledge the need to protect the internet's architecture, its integrity and ongoing functioning as we know it, to acknowledge the decentralized technical management of the internet subject to transparency and being accountable to the global community, to preserve the end-to-end nature of the internet, to ensure users have the greatest possible access to internet-based content, applications, and services of their choice, and last but not least, to preserve cultural and linguistic diversity. To achieve this principle, governments will find it hard to act alone, especially as technology is moving much faster than the law. The full participation of governments, including, of course, that of the Russian Federation, is important for us to carry out our work in helping users to understand and exercise their rights more effectively. And I draw your attention on the preparation within the Council of Europe of a compendium of rights of users scheduled to be adopted in early 2014. In altering stakeholders of the risk to fundamental rights stemming from digital tracking and other surveillance technologies, the Council of Europe is preparing a declaration on this issue. In understanding the human rights implications of new generic top-level domain names, and in this context, the Council of Europe has prepared human rights commentary for the Governmental Advisory Committee of ICANN. And finally, in engaging the private sector in dialogue to protect and respect human rights online. On this issue, I underline that the right of freedom of expression is the only provision, the only article in the European Convention on Human Rights which explicitly refers to responsibilities. Ladies and gentlemen, in shaping the Internet we want, one which is open, safe, and secure, we must ensure a people-focused approach to its development and the protection of users' freedom. This requires learning from the past in moving forward. As Anton Chekhov said, knowledge is of no value unless you put it into practice. I thank you for your kind attention.
Спасибо, Philip. Thank you, Philip. Thank you for bringing us a few important political statements, because we have some news on the TV, but it's very rare that somebody's staying on the stage saying what kind of conventions really did Russia sign and have to bind to. So thank you very much. Спасибо.
Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Desiree Milosevic. She's a co-chair of the ISOC committee. And in this slide, I would like to say that the Internet is first and foremost driven by the fact that people who deal with Internet don't have to turn to anyone for permission to do anything. And this is what differs the Internet from other spheres of our life. Desiree, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrei, and and good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay.
Making sure.
It's a little bit better. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Desiree Milosevic. I'm a chair of the Internet Society Advisory Council of organizational members. And on behalf of the Internet Society, we'd like to thank you for inviting us here today to take part in the Russian RIGF and to take part in this important national dialogue, at the same time a global dialogue that we have on Internet governance. So with that, I would like to congratulate you for all your efforts in continuing to put on Russian Internet Governance Forum, realizing that this is the fourth Russian Internet Governance Forum. And thank you for keeping the dialogue open. We are delighted to be here today, and we are delighted to be able to share our views and with all the participants here in the room and online and to share also some of our challenges that we all face together in terms of internet governance area, and to take this opportunity to engage and really work together with all stakeholders in Russia to move forward on some of these challenges, be it of a technical nature, such as the adoption and adoption of the IPv6 protocol, or be it the adoption and deployment of domain name DNSSEC, a security protocol, or be it a policy challenge, even a developmental challenge, such as getting more users online, something that we heard this morning, very good news from this region from your minister, how many internet users you have and how important that is, that you also develop capacity to address all the policy challenges that come with that. With that, and just mentioning, I would like also to say that if we were to continue to work together, we have to build upon the existing success of all the organizations, institutions, and member states, civil society, and private sector that have already been practicing and have fully embraced the multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance. We know, and maybe just a few words about Internet Society's mission. For those of you for who this is a new organization, we've been there since 1992, and our mission is to promote the open development and evolution and the use of Internet for the benefits of all the users throughout the world. ISOC facilitates the development of open standards, protocols, and administration and Internet infrastructure by being a home organization for the Internet Engineering Task Force. I think you'll hear more about that later on from other speakers. I would just say that Internet Society has been known as a voice of technical Internet community, but we also do very important work in policy shaping and especially more recently doing work in rights advocacy as well. So we provide coordination for strategy and efforts and outreach and educational and facilities as well for many developing countries. But you can find out more about that. What I think is interesting to say here, that we are happy that the Russian chapter of Internet Society has also recently been formed. So I would like to know and recognize Sergei Sharikov, if he's in the room, to please stand up, or any other Internet Society chapter members of. It is really an important step forward. We are very well aware of the vector of controversies and the countries and member states face when dealing with an issue such as civil society and groups. Would you like to say a couple of words about the chapter?
Да, я бы хотел сказать несколько слов.
Yes, I would like to say a few words on behalf of our team, which comprises various key figures dealing with the Russian part of the Internet. Many of you are present here. I'm talking about such people as Alexei Platonov, Alexei Soldatov, Andrei Kolesnikov, Mikhail Yakushev, Alexander Panov, Oleg Lebedev, Sergei Plugatarenko, Galina Soldatova. We are trying to develop our own Russia-based Internet community as part of the global ISOC organization, and secondly, as an open platform and venue for all Russian Internet users. Because we want their voice, experience, and talents to be capitalized on to develop the Internet. And in the near future, we will invite each and every one of you to become a member of a non-profit partnership dealing with the development of the Russian internet, and any internet user, any organization will be able to take part in the work of international institutions to develop internet standards, come up with educational programs, and all of you will be able to state your opinions and to be heard on any issues pertaining to developing and operating the internet. Thank you. And seizing the opportunity, I would like to thank the European-based ISOC Bureau, Jacek Gajewski, the Frederick Danka, for their support. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you very much, Sergey. Sergey is also an author, together with myself, of one of the best common practice documents on IDN adoption in Cyrillic language. So he contributes actively to the work of the Internet Engineering Task Force. Thank you for volunteering and doing a great work. So far we have addressed some of the issues, but I'd like to just leave on a note that the Internet Society is willing to engage and team up with all the actors and work together through our regional bureaus that exist in Europe. We have Frederick Dong here from Internet Society in the room, heading the regional bureau, Jacek as well, heading the chapters. And we work through organizational members, and we have more than 60,000 individual members who actively participate in the policy shaping and evolution of the next open, robust, resilient internet that we all like to keep and share. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for our time here today.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, our conference has been kicked off, and there will be several interesting announcements shortly, but I would like to say a few words about one of the participants in today's conference. It goes without saying that most of you probably know the person I'm talking about. That's Steve Crocker, and this is a legend of the internet. And most of the things that we're used to now on the internet, and the things that we use, the technologies that we apply, were developed due to the fact that there are people who spare no effort, who spare no intellectual resources, and who spare no engineering skills to develop brand new things that have never existed before. So what is Steve famous for? I believe that the most important thing is that he's the author of the request for ICANN standards. This is a series of protocols and standards that serve as the foundation for the internet. Well, RFC is the foundation for the internet per se, and all the internet technologies in particular. Therefore, we're quite happy to welcome the so-called founding father of the internet here. And of course, Steve also worked on the ARPA project, the US-run project. Despite the fact that we all know that the project was financed by the Pentagon, nevertheless, we, as an ultimate result, we received the internet, which is a civil network. In addition to that, he is a chairman of ICANN, which proves that he's still interested in the outside world. He still comes up with new things, and of course we should praise him for that. And the Shinkura Corporation is yet another thing where he works. Steve is still a scientist. He still runs very interesting researches for the benefit of all of us. Steve, it's my understanding that you're going to deliver a short lecture to all of us. The floor is yours. Coming up on stage.
So once again, Andre, you embarrassed me with too much praise. It is a real pleasure to be here, and a little bit daunting to be able to address all of you. The activity in Russia is very impressive, enormous amount of network activity and all of the consequent developments that go with it. Let me thank Minister Nikiforov, Minister Sverdlov, Deputy Minister Sverdlov and Shkolov, and Andrei Kolesnov particularly, and everybody else in the Coordination Center for .ru, and everyone else who's contributed to this event. And I particularly want to thank Desiree, whom I've had the pleasure of working with for a number of years, and also because once upon a time I was on the board of the Internet Society, and as you will see as I get into my talk, I think the Internet Society plays an extraordinarily important role throughout the entire Internet community. I mentioned the developments and activity in Russia, and certainly one of the most important is the .ru Coordination Center. There are now, at this moment, 3 top-level domains in Russia: .ru, the pre-existing .su, and the more recent Cyrillic.rf. And the growth of these operations, particularly the introduction of the IDN.rf, has been leading within the entire world and has really been a model. And so I think that we owe a moment of recognition to the great success. So let me ask you to join me in congratulating Andre and his operation. I also was pleased to hear about the rise of e-commerce in Russia, particularly since yesterday it took an hour or more to get in from the airport, and during discussion over dinner, I learned that there's nomenclature for the size of the traffic jams, and that last night was a level 9 traffic jam. So it goes together very well to have the rise of e-commerce, where you don't have to actually go out on the street to have commerce, and as a solution to the ever-rising traffic problem. Do we have the capability of putting up slides? Okay, let me call for it. And good. Pull that down for just a second, and I will ask for it momentarily. So about 2 weeks ago, ICANN held its one of its 3 annual meetings, this time in Beijing, China, and it was, by all of the usual measures, a great success. It was the largest that we've had to date, with heavy participation from both the local Chinese community and from outside. Extremely strong, warm reception from all of the Chinese community, including the government. And now you can put that slide up. And the reception, the gala in the middle of the week, was held at the Great Hall of the People, which is a particular honor not available to most people, either inside or outside of China, and represented both a singular honor and a very symbolic and meaningful gesture. One of the things to note about China is the very large number of people, not only who are in China, of course, as we all know, but the number of people who are using the internet. Growth has grown from 59 million in 2002 to almost 10 times that many. 564 million are the numbers that were given, or 42% of the population in 2013. A very high percentage of mobile users, and a significant number of them are quite young. I think you can pull that down for a minute now and just leave things blank, if you would. Thank you. So let me turn to the meat. Let me turn to the meat of what I want to cover today. I chose the title "When Less Is More" as a kind of provocative way of introducing the idea that it's not essential to govern everything in all of its different aspects. One of the questions that I think is important to ask is why is governance necessary? What has to be accomplished? And if there are no good answers to that, then perhaps the answer is stand back and let things evolve for a while until it becomes essential that governance is required. So I've had the privilege of being around for a very long time and watching this process from essentially from the beginning. And one of the things that has really made the internet flourish has been this very light hand of leaving things open and not trying to over-constrain in any respect, not over-constraining the technology, not over-constraining the usage, and not over-constraining the rules in order to allow things to grow and evolve and to be innovative wherever they might be. That strategy has brought us surprises in a positive sense that we could not have easily planned. And that's a very strong statement because the environment in which the original network, the ARPANET, was built had the advantage of being built in a very rich technical environment where a lot of advanced research in computer science was taking place. It's probably not so obvious, but I'm talking about a period that is, as I look around the room, predates even many of you even being born. I'm talking about the mid-1960s, late 1960s, early 1970s. We had laboratories that were, the mouse had been invented, hypertext links, as you would call them, had been invented. And these were working in the laboratory and being used not just in an experimental basis, but on a regular daily basis. What had not happened was that had not become mass-produced and available to the general population. Computers were big and expensive, and these laboratories were for very few people to use as opposed to millions of people. But the ideas were there. Fancy graphics, similar to what we have available today in our pockets, massive amounts of computing, all of which were we could either had in instance or we could see coming. So we had a very, very good picture of what the technology was going to be in the future. We did not have quite as clear a picture about how it was going to evolve commercially, and we did not have a first-class picture of who was going to use this and how it was going to affect all of our lives. But it was pretty clear, even before 1970, as we began to put this first network together, that in relatively short order, it would become important for computers to be connected, not just a few computers, but basically every computer, and that would be normal. We also knew full well that we could not plan all of this in detail. So we made a very strong point of doing our design work in a way that left room for others to add to it. And this led eventually to surprises such as the creation of Skype, a very, very widely used voice over IP being created in Estonia. And I can tell you that most of us would not have been able to find Estonia on a map in those days. This led to the creation of eBay and Google and Facebook and so forth, created by children, college students. Well, they were our age, except that we got older, but they were the same age when they created all that as we were when we were creating the ARPANET. So the importance of leaving the systems open in every respect, not only from a technology point of view, but also from a participation point of view, that anybody could participate. I had the somewhat accidental but fortunate privilege of creating what I thought was an informal set of notes that we called requests for comments. I expected that they would last for a few months back in 1969. They've lasted a bit longer, and they are now reached the state where it's impossible to kill them off. More surprises. So when we come to the governance question, the question that comes to mind is not who should govern or what the rules should be, but the more fundamental question, what has to be governed? What is it that invites or requires governance at all? And I would postulate that there are basically three broad areas that draw our attention to governance. One is technical stability. Will the system work reliably? Can it be disrupted? And if it could be disrupted, then we need some degree of prevention against that. And when we talk about the system, well, what is the system? Is it just the raw transport of packets from one place to another? Or does it include critical systems? And if it includes critical systems, again, the question is, so exactly what are critical systems? Usually that term is used by people in authority to mean government operations, but you and I know that if you take down Facebook or YouTube or Google or Amazon or the news service, that will leave an awful lot of people unhappy, and we'll find out that those two are considered to be critical resources. Another element that is very, very important, obviously, but is questionable as to whether it's part of what you might think of as a system, are the individual enterprises. If a major corporation is shut off, or if its secrets are stolen, or if its systems internally are disrupted, how important is that? Well, it's quite important, but it's a question as to whether or not that is part of the internet per se, or is simply one system that is connected to the internet. And these questions don't have precise yes or no answers. And depending upon what your interests are, you may view those as part of the system. So all of this is part of what I'll call the technical stability question. And we do indeed depend very heavily on the continued operation of the internet. And so anything that might disrupt that is of great importance to us, and to the extent that we need some degree of control over that or protection, then that invites one of the reasons to impose some degree of governance. The second reason for governance is allocation of scarce resources. And again, this is not such a straightforward question. Very often, addresses and domain names are viewed as scarce resources, and that leads to the creation of the organization that I'm part of these days, ICANN, and I'll come back to ICANN in a bit. There's a lot of debate about whether addresses and domain names are actually scarce resources, and the details get to be a little murky. Addresses are just numbers, and when I was in school and we were learning about numbers, the answer is you could keep counting indefinitely. There are plenty of numbers, as many as you like. However, as you heard earlier, once upon a time, there was a design put in place that suggested 4 billion numbers would be enough for the entire network for as far as we could see. And that turned out to be somewhat short-sighted. There are not quite 4 billion users, but the numbers don't get used exactly one for each person, metered out one at a time. And we have exhausted that system, and so we're in a very painful transition to a system that is much, much, much bigger. It is 4 times the length, which means it's 4 billion times 4 billion times 4 billion times 4 billion. That's a very big number. There are names for that, but the names don't mean anything to most of us, not even to me. And we will work through this. It will take several years. We're in the what I would call roughly phase 2. We've passed the very beginning of the design and the deployment of IPv6, and so we're now in an early phase of adoption and a rise of IPv6, and we'll have a coexistence between IPv6 and IPv4 for several years. The IPv4 networks are not going to go away quickly. That's okay. And at some point, when IPv6 has become the dominant network, individual operators will make the decision to make their transition over to IPv6. The domain name aspect of this is a whole nother story. Like numbers, there are plenty of domain names, as many as you might like, but the whole point of domain names was to be more accessible for humans, things that people could remember and communicate. And that puts great weight on certain names at the expense of other names. And so short names are important, easy to remember names, names that have value in commerce or in social discourse. And so then that leads to competition of who gets to use a particular name, how do you sort out conflicts over those, and out of that, a significant amount of complexity arises. Over some period of time that was handled very simply and informally, and when it became an important matter that we had a lot of complications, ICANN was formed, and I'll come back to that a bit more. The third area that I think invites governance is what I'll call the suppression of socially unacceptable behavior, which is a very broad term that covers everything from harsh speech to outright criminal behavior or worse. A full spectrum of annoyances, child pornography, identity theft, espionage, and so forth. And I say these as if they're all part of one broad topic, and they are to the extent that these are antisocial behavior that we find ourselves desiring to control. But the details are significantly different as you move from one topic to another, and so the mechanisms for suppression and the basis for action all vary considerably. One can get a very high degree of consensus and cooperation on matters, for example, of child pornography, where every instance is an abuse of a child, a criminal abuse, and then as you move towards softer things, harsh speech or political content, then there is an enormous amount of variation as you move from one culture to another and from one jurisdiction to another. So those are the three broad areas that I would recommend are the fundamental bases for what to govern. And I have deliberately tried to say not very much about how to govern, who should govern, and all of that. That has to evolve over a period of time. I will say a bit about what the current state of affairs is. I talked earlier about the very early days in which we built a network to connect different research centers within a U.S. research environment, and recognized pretty early that we should spend as little time as possible on formal governance mechanisms and as much time as possible on solving technical issues, on communicating with each other, and of developing the technology. Out of that led to one of the most important multi-stakeholder internet governance mechanisms, the Internet Engineering Task Force. And I use the words multi-stakeholder and internet governance even though those words are not the words that you find in common use within the Internet Engineering Task Force. What they talk about are protocols and interoperability and whether or not things are actually going to work. And it is just a feature, it is just an aspect of the way that they are organized, that it is an entirely open operation. Anybody can attend any meeting, anybody can be on any mailing list, anybody can submit either a new design or comments on an old design. And for people who arrive in that setting from a traditional governance perspective, it is a very confusing environment. Who's in charge? How do you vote? How do you make any decisions? How do you enforce the decisions that are made? And the answers are surprisingly hard to come by. There's no voting. What do you mean there's no voting? How do you make a decision? Well, you sit in a room, or you sit on a mailing list, and you thrash it out until you reach a stable point of consensus. Mostly this works. Yes, sometimes it doesn't quite work, but like any system that involves people, there's a lot of situations that don't quite work. But it does work, and it works because it's a constructive process. It is not a zero-sum game. It is one in which everybody wins if you reach reasonable agreements, and then you get to go build products and systems and do future designs that all depend upon that. What's the enforcement mechanism? Is there a rule that says you have to implement to a particular standard? The rule is really a marketplace rule. If you don't, then nobody pays attention to you. And that's a very, very strong enforcement mechanism. The IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, is not alone. When the World Wide Web was created, then a whole set of issues arose very rapidly, and that led to the creation of the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, which in some respects is parallel to the IETF, but focused just on the web and not on the richer and broader set of protocols. And it also focuses on a number of social issues that are not generally within the IETF's purview. Those two organizations are strongly rooted in technology. In 1988, late in 1988, in November, we were woken up with the Morris worm, which was a piece of malware that copied itself from machine to machine, took over the machines. It was somewhat of a mistake by a graduate student who was trying to perform a small experiment, not necessarily intending to do harm, but it alerted us that the whole network was at risk and that we needed a different mechanism for communicating these vulnerabilities within an extraordinarily short period of time, measured roughly in days. The first Computer Emergency Response Team, or CERT, was created, and that has led to the creation of similar organizations around the world. The creation of CERT, the creation of the IETF, the creation of W3C, the creation of the Internet Society more than 20 years ago, all are in response to needs that were felt throughout the community and that brought people together saying, let's try to be helpful here. One of the pieces of evolution that has triggered the creation of ICANN is the rise of the domain name system. The original business of identifying a machine or a site was very, very simple. The ARPANET started as 4 nodes on the west coast, western part of the United States. We had a very complicated numbering system, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we had very complicated naming system. I was at UCLA, and that was exactly what we called that node. The second node was at Stanford Research Institute, which was commonly known as SRI, and sure enough, SRI is the name that was given to that node. University of California, Santa Barbara, UCSB, number 3, and the University of Utah had the very complicated name Utah. Those 4 names expanded as the ARPANET expanded, and the list grew longer and longer. Soon it was a dozen, and then it was a few dozen. And that list of the corresponding names to the numbers were simply sent out on a regular basis from a central site. After a while, that list got to be a bit too long. and the maintenance of it was problematic. John Postel and most particularly Paul Macapetris sat down and designed the current domain name system that is based on a hierarchical allocation of names in order to divide up the namespace and to decentralize it. And the decentralization is the most important aspect. And so that's the name system that we have today. John Postel spent a lot of time fostering the development of two halves of that system, the so-called generic names, com and net and org. And incidentally, com was the small, tiny part that was supposed to take care of the parts that didn't fit into the real major parts. There were two domains for top-level domains for the U.S. government, one for the civilian side and one for the military side. There was .net to cover the what today we would call ISPs, .edu to cover the universities, .org to cover the nonprofits, and this tiny little .com to cover the pieces that were commercial organizations that happened to didn't fit in anywhere else. And of course, as we know, when the internet was opened up for commercial use, the .com domain grew enormously and is now well over 100 million entries. John Postel put a much greater amount of work into fostering the development of the country code top-level domains, and of which .ru is a typical example. And there, again, seeking to avoid as many problems as possible, found that there was an existing set of two-letter codes provided by a UN agency, the so-called ISO 3166 maintenance agency, and developed a very simple rule of saying, we will use those codes and not have to have a separate adjudication as to who owns what code. That has saved quite a bit of time and energy and has worked out pretty well. It hasn't solved all problems. As we've moved toward internationalized domain names, we now have a new set of issues that are not so easily solved. A relatively small part of that whole ecosystem is the making sure that the very top level of the domain name system is ultra reliable. This is the so-called root server system, so that every lookup of a domain name that has to go all the way up to the root is answered with a high degree of reliability. I'll say perfect because it's in fact never been disrupted, and is answered very quickly. Let me have the next slide. Yep. So a consortium of 13 root operators, actually 12 root operators, one of whom is running two separate systems, came into existence, and each of them runs its own set of root servers, some of which are hundreds of separate sites around the world. This is a map. This is available online anytime, www.root-servers.org. And in addition to this pretty picture, if you go online, you'll see that right below it is a list of all of the locations for each of the 13 constellations. And there are, they're not uniformly distributed, nothing is in this world, but they're pretty broadly distributed and more coming all the time. There's several root server instances in Russia, and I believe the plans are to expand that even more. This is another interesting element in the internet governance space, in that the set of root server operators are in fact independent themselves, not part of any other organization, and have their own small set of rules, principally focused on making sure that the information that is put into the root zone is distributed and made available uniformly across the world, and very carefully not trying to take on any other tasks. Very limited, very focused, and as a consequence, despite the fact that they have essentially zero visibility in terms of real structure or the kinds of rules that one would expect, if you were to ask the question of who do you trust in the internet ecosystems, and you included the root server operators, you would find, I believe, that they would come way up at the top of the list because they only try to do that job. They don't try to do anything else. They're not trying to take over from anybody else. They're not trying to interfere with anything. And they would just get a complete vote of confidence without any further thought. Another very important part of the ecosystem are the what's so-called regional internet registries, the RIRs. These are the organizations that manage the address space across the internet. There is RIPE NCC, headquartered in Amsterdam, that serves the European region, ARIN for North America, APNIC in the Asia-Pacific region, and then the more recent creation of the Latin American Caribbean Network Information Center in Montevideo, Uruguay, and AFRINIC, headquartered in Mauritius. Other parts of the ecosystem, of course, are the top-level domain operators in each country, the routing registries that help provide the routing information that goes into the actual operation of the ISPs, and I mentioned the certs earlier. So this is a very rich ecology, and of course, there is also the Internet Society. So I want to turn to the next slide. One of the interesting exercises is to try to draw a picture of the ecosystem. And what I'm going to show you are two pictures, this one from the Internet Society and the next one from ICANN, each trying to draw the same picture, and you will see that they will be very different. So this one, thank you for flipping back and forth. Just leave this for a second. This one shows the Internet Society in a very nicely balanced picture, and this is available in multiple places, particularly on the Internet Society's site, and maybe we can make it available here too. And now let's see the next one. And here is a whole different interpretation, covering essentially the same material but viewed through a different lens, with some care to try not to put ourselves in the middle of the picture too badly, and equally on the ISOC side. It's very important, I think it's very important, that we have this multiplicity, that we have these multiple organizations. And we spend quite a bit of time cooperating, communicating, and coordinating with each other. Like any family, there's some internal squabbles, but they are the squabbles of siblings who are knowingly part of the same family rather than mortal enemies, despite what it sometimes feels like. What we all know is that the broader, bigger purpose is to make the Internet accessible to all of humanity, to provide a very rich framework for it to grow, and to remain open in every respect. Open to new technologies is what we would expect me to say, and that's certainly true, but open to participation, open to new people, open to new cultures, and embracing in every single dimension. Finally, let me now focus on what I don't exactly get paid very much, but what I'm supposed to do here, which is tell you about ICANN. So this is the ecosystem from the ICANN view, and let me have the next slide as well. Here is another picture of the ICANN view of Internet governance, and the reason it is so wordy is because we try to squeeze in a description of all of these other parts of the ecosystem. ICANN was formed in 1988. That makes us 15 years old. I don't know what your experience is with 15-year-olds, but it's a very uncomfortable age. And we're working our way through it. The 15-year-olds that I've known, including myself, looked pretty ungainly, awkward, And the magical thing that happens is in a very short period of time, they start to look pretty adult and speak appropriately and even dress appropriately. And I'm hopeful that we will be there. ICANN was formed as a California nonprofit corporation. People make a great deal about that. It is essentially irrelevant. We have to be somewhere. We have to have some sort of corporate structure. There are some details that we adhere to by being a U.S.-based entity, but if we were anywhere else, we would have a comparable set of issues. We perform basically two major functions. One is what we call the IANA function. This is the coordination of the unique identifiers for the Internet, the IP addresses and the autonomous system numbers. But wait, you said that the regional Internet registries control the addresses, and that's true. What we do is we serve that community. We adhere to the policies that they set, and we're a kind of clerical servant that doles out blocks of addresses to the regional Internet registries in accordance with the policies that they tell us to handle. And the same with what we call autonomous system numbers, which are another part of the routing structure. We also coordinate the top-level domains, as you know. And a less well-known, but actually much more active than either of the other two parts, is we publish the parameters associated with the quite large number of Internet protocols that come out of the IETF. So that's the IANA function. The other half of what we do is the oversight of the generic half of the domain name system. This is the part that is not the country codes. This is com, net, org, .museum, .aero, and so forth. And we have formal contracts, business contracts, with both the registries that operate those top-level domains and the registrars, which are the retail side of the operation that sell the use of domain names on behalf of the registries. We don't have any direct oversight over the country code registries and registrars. Some might view that as a problem. I actually view that as a perhaps accidental but extraordinarily beneficial arrangement, because the independence that the CCTLDs have means that each of them is dealing with its own set of issues, and to the extent that there are common issues across the community, providing their own solutions that can be compared and copied or discarded by others. It is, from a biological perspective, the same as having a very rich diversity of species, and that richness, I think, saves us from falling into the trap of having monolithic control and sometimes in a positive sense, but not uncommonly veering off in some negative direction. And so I'm very pleased that we get the examples that are evident around the world to draw from. So those are the two things that ICANN does. Let me tell you a few things that ICANN does not do. We do not have anything to do with the control of routing of packets on the Internet. We don't have anything to do with the content, much as people might like us to do. And we have essentially nothing to do with the vast array of security issues on the Internet, except in the areas that are directly related to our coordination function and our own operation. It seems like, if one didn't know anything, that that's very modest business and it ought to take hardly any time and hardly any energy. But it hasn't worked out that way. We have attracted a huge amount of political attention. That's both good and bad. From the good side, we are a quintessential multi-stakeholder operation. I make a point of saying we're not the only one. I talked about the IETF earlier. And the way we do it is not the only way that you can have a multi-stakeholder operation, but we are certainly one example. And by multi-stakeholder, it means that all voices are welcome, that no single voice is absolute, This drives governments crazy sometimes because they think that they're governments and therefore they must have a final word. That's an ongoing dialogue. I imagine it will go on for quite some time. The registries and the registrars sometimes also have trouble with this. They're the ones that are responsible for the operation. They're the ones that have financial stake, and sometimes they have trouble with the idea that there should be other voices that have something to do with the policies about how things happen. We make an extraordinary effort to be both transparent and accountable. Sometimes I watch the criticism level and I see that the more we try to be transparent, the more criticism we get. So I'm not sure whether or not we should run in the opposite direction. But it's a very deeply held conviction that we are not in control. We are stewards and servants, and that we must be careful about what we do, and we must be very, very clear in explaining what we do, why we do it, and in listening to all sources. So transparency is critical. Accountability is critical. We've put so much energy into transparency and accountability that I've taken to trying to provide a counterbalance and say, by the way, we actually have a job that we have to get done. Efficiency and effectiveness are also important. If we're only accountable and transparent and we're completely ineffective, we will disappear, nobody will care. So that's the balance that we try to attain. Nonetheless, there's continuing confusion about our role, and we often hear ICANN is in charge, ICANN isn't transparent, ICANN should do this or ICANN should do that. And it is going to take a while, I think, for everybody to become comfortable with us. And but we're just 15, and my hope is by the time we reach the age of adulthood, people will stop talking about us. We have quite a lot of attention heaped on us. It provides both an opportunity and a very slippery slope. Sometimes we get carried away. But that attention has its positive aspects. Recently, at the World Conference on International Telecommunications, or WICIT, our CEO, Fadi Shahadi, and I were honored to be guests of the Secretary General of ITU, Hamadoun Touré. And we continue to look for ways to communicate, to cooperate, and even collaborate with the ITU, along with, of course, all other organizations. One of the things that's become very visible to us is the difficulty of having a single strategy that works uniformly across the world. We've initiated regional strategies in Africa, in the Arab community, in the Latin American community, in the Asian community, to work more closely with both governments and with people and organizations throughout the world. We are also in a very aggressive move to decentralize our headquarters operation. Our headquarters is in Los Angeles. It grew very naturally out of the pre-existing location where John Postel was in Marina del Rey. We're now dividing up that headquarters, including putting key senior people who report directly to the CEO in 3 locations. Los Angeles will remain. Istanbul and Singapore are the other 2 locations. And our CEO has committed to himself living part of the time in each of those locations. He will set a very high standard for anybody who wants to follow him. I don't know how easy it is to do that. So I return to the point that I was making, that for every pressure regarding governance, the question that I'd like to see asked is there indeed actually a governance question? Do we need to do it? And we could be either ICANN, or it could be the same question asked of any other organization. Do we need to do it, or is it best done by others? And even if we're involved, how can we coordinate? How can we cooperate? How can we communicate with others so that it is not a unilateral operation? So that's my primary description of what we're doing. I want to close with a mention that part of our governance process is that we have key people selected for the board and for our councils, selected by a nominations committee. The nominations committee is a separate operation drawn from volunteers from different parts of the community. Can I have the last slide? Oh, I skipped over this whole description. I'll come back to this if you wish for me to get into the gory details about how we're organized. But let me get to this slide. So we're a week away, maybe 6 days away, from closing the nominations process for this year. But it is not too late. It is possible to put together a credible statement of interest and submit it. We are recruiting 3 members of the board of directors, 3 on the at-large advisory committee from the areas of Africa, Asia Pacific, and Latin America, Caribbean, 2 for the generic name supporting organization, 2 counselors, and a counselor on the for the country code, CCNSO, Country Code Name Supporting Organization Council. I think it would be fabulous to have a Russian on the board, but I have to say that our first priority, at least as we've communicated to the nominations committee, is that we need people who have the requisite experience to help guide and oversee a operation that is got quite a lot of money involved, at least a lot of money compared to what it used to be. Our budgets these days are in the order of $70 million a year, and we have somewhat north of $300 million that have come in through the generic names with GTLD program. Overseeing the finances, overseeing the processes require the kind of adult experience that is attained in business, attained in government, attained in other areas, and we seek that kind of talent from every part of the world. With that, let me close. I'm more than happy to take questions on any subject, and if you want me to go back to the org chart and talk in detail about how all of the parts of ICANN are constructed, I'll be happy to do that.
Thank you, Steve. Since you don't have a translation in your ears, I'll speak English to you. First of all, thank you for your wonderful presentation. But the most important thing that you deserve a little prize from the community, and it's called Interneti Virtuti, or Virtuti Interneti. It's a Latin word, whatever. So it's a little thing, which is our invention and our know-how. You invent RFCs, and, you know, we invent the award. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You deserve it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
И вопросы, пожалуйста, сейчас.
It's high time for Q&A session, so if you have any questions, shoot away. Who will be internet users several years down the line? Problems and challenges, what do you think about that?
So I'm obliged, unfortunately, to answer in English. Who will be the users down the line in several years? Everybody. Everybody. Actually, what I think will happen is slightly different from what you may be expecting. We have a situation today in which between 1.25% of the entire world is using the internet and are internet users in the sense that they. But over the next period of time, I think 2 things will happen. One is the number of users will expand. I think that figure will double. But the other thing that will happen is I think the internet will get submerged a bit and be inside and underneath rather than out front and visible. And so that people will be using the internet but not thinking that they are using the internet, that our devices will all automatically be connected. One of the phenomena that's really quite amusing in a way is that with the iPad, we've discovered that children who are too young to talk and too young to type can somehow understand their cognitive abilities are sufficient to actually get quite a bit of action out of an iPad. I do not want to have the conversation with a 18-month-old child, are you an internet user? He would not understand the question, and he would be very impatient with me trying to have that conversation with him. But the answer is yes, of course he's an internet user.
Пожалуйста, еще вопрос.
Any other questions?
Hello, this is Jeff from Cross Public Relations and Public Affairs Company. I would like to ask you, what do you think about darknets and networks such as Tor and the whole principle of onion routing, which is actually, I think, which was created for military purposes, but it can be turned into an extremely powerful tool to hide for everyone and people. We see nowadays people trading child pornography and other things, and it's basically impossible to track people if they are using these networks. So what do you think is the way to cope with these dangerous networks?
Yeah. So there's several different things that you've mentioned there. I'm actually going to try to give you a somewhat serious answer to some of that, because you mentioned Tor, you mentioned onion routing, you mentioned darknets, and child pornography. There's actually some very important distinctions within that. Some of those pieces of Tor, onion routing, for example, are pieces of technology that have multiple uses and were created for both legitimate uses and have been purposed for ways of hiding inappropriate activity. Darknets are a whole other matter. Those are networks that are operated behind the scenes to hide their activity almost solely for negative purposes. The child pornography situation is more interesting than it first appears. I had the privilege of spending some quality time with a man who is deeply committed to tracking down child pornographers, who works for Interpol. And I was quite interested in his perspective on the role of technologies of the kind that you're describing to his job, and whether or not the creation of additional technologies that might make it hard to see what's going on inside were really terrible from his point of view, or something that he knew how to deal with. His response was remarkably mature and sophisticated. This is a man who is a policeman through and through, an Irish cop who's moved into technology, not a technologist who's moved into tracking criminals. And his answer was both deep and simple at the same time. It was the only way that they're going to succeed is that they have to get inside of those systems. They have to learn the technology, and they have to track criminals in the old-fashioned way. That it isn't a question of trying to ban a particular piece of technology. They simply have to do the same job that they have always done, stay current with the technology, infiltrate the social networks. And by social networks, I don't mean the Facebook, but I mean the people, the human organizations. It's very difficult, very nasty work, and from his point of view, there is no way out. It is one of the complications of modern life, and it is not, it's actually one of the complications, I should say, of human life, and it's the same whether it's modern or whether it's ancient.
Еще вопросы, пожалуйста.
Any other questions? My name is Ivan Klimenko. I have the following question. the internet requires a common starting point. At your globe, you demonstrated the timelines crossing the Pacific. Why don't you use the Greenwich? Why doesn't ICANN, what does ICANN use as the starting point?
If I understand the question, it is why do we use the Greenwich marker for the change of day? Yeah.
Наоборот.
No, it's quite just the opposite. At the slide you demonstrated depicting the globe, there was a date change line on the, and it goes across the Pacific.
This is, why don't we put up slide 2 again? I think this was the root server slide. Is this the one you were talking about? No.
Yes.
So it's that line down the middle there. So I must say I have to applaud you. That's a question that in 40 plus years nobody has asked me about this before. But I think the answer is very simple. The whole point of the internet is to solve new problems, not to go back and unsolve old problems. That's the international dateline that we've all grown up with. I don't know if there's other systems that are in use around the world. If there are, I'm unfamiliar with them. But it has not ever occurred to us to try to undo that.
Нет, есть нулевой.
Well, there is the Greenwich meridian, as you well know.
Yes, it's all part of the same system. The Greenwich meridian is the zero longitude, excuse me, point, and this is essentially modulo some adjustments for different countries. 180 degrees on the other side.
Okay, thank you. Еще вопрос, пожалуйста.
Any other questions? Good morning, Steve. My name is Mikhail Yakushev, and I have the following philosophical question. Our event is called the 4th Russian Internet Governance Forum. As we can see, the Internet becomes a service with a growing number of end users. And to a certain extent, well, we saw the hopes we pinned on registering domains. I don't think anyone will be able to make much money 5 to 10 years down the line without providing additional services. If you are an internet user from the moment you were born, just like we are today with regards to utilities, I believe that 10 to 15 years later, people will not even think about the internet governance. For instance, right now, we are not even concerned about the company that is serving the bathrooms here and is providing the electric power. Well, these are issues that are regulated and governed without us even knowing that. So the paradox is, do you think that all these issues will be discussed 10 to 15 years down the line, or do you think that they will not be as important as they are today?
That question a lot. The ideal is that we would not be discussing internet governance 10 or 15 years. Just as if we had to be discussing the management of who cleans the bathrooms, it would probably be for reasons that would not be very pleasant. So I'm glad we're not discussing that, and I would hope that we will not be discussing internet governance in 10 or 15 years.
Пожалуйста, время еще на один вопрос.
We still have time for another question. member of the Committee of the European Council for the Rights of the Internet Users.
About your place in this equilibrium, which is called Internet. Are you personally a greater champion of greater governance of Internet, or of greater freedom, or you take middle ground? How would you elaborate on that? Because, for instance, a lot of Europeans believe that ICANN is very close to the government, being stationed in western US, in California. So, how would you elaborate on the required or non-required level of proximity to the officialdom, to the authorities, to the governments? In other words, can we find that golden mean, so to say, in between greater governance and freedom? Thank you.
There's always a question of appearances versus what the facts are. And in both cases, there's room for debate, and then trying to reconcile both the appearances and the facts is another challenge. Yes, ICANN is incorporated as an operating entity within the United States, and yes, there's a formal relationship with the U.S. government. If you look closely at what that formal relationship is, and if you look closely at the transactions that take place and how they take place, you'll find that there is relatively little direct control by the United States government, and that if people within the U.S. government were to try to exert greater control, that the result would be quite noisy. It would be heard around the world. And I think no group knows that better than the group that is directly involved inside the U.S. government. So that's, at least from where I sit, and I sit in a pretty good place, and I've been watching for a very long time, is what the facts are. The appearances, when viewed from a distance, of course, are quite different. It looks like a U.S. entity, and therefore the U.S. government must be in control. I think that is unfortunate. It is a convenience sometimes in a larger political dialogue, and it is a misperception in some respects. That does not mean, when I say all that, that I don't recognize that over some period of time we must do something. What to do about it is challenging. It is easy, very easy, to do something much worse. And there are many ways to do something much worse. So what has eluded us, and which I would invite constructive, positive suggestions, is, so what would you do instead? I can tell you some of the easy things, not so easy, but seemingly easy things, that would not be so good. Give it to the UN. You have to be kidding. That would not be so good. Create a new multi-government organization that oversees it. Are you serious? When's the last time that that was successfully done? And so you can make up a list. Just go on and on and on. So it is a very tricky business. The U.S. government is, in a way, in its own very difficult position, because it takes a lot of criticism, and yet it cannot exert force in an overbearing way without getting into worse trouble. And so in a way, there is a real debt that we owe the U.S. government for taking on this burden without any thanks at all. That would be a way of looking at it. I'm sure that that will not be the immediate reaction in this room, but that's okay. But anyway, it's a challenging situation, and one that gets a lot of thought, and I wish that I had a perfect, complete solution. It's one of these problems that we're working on over time, and I truly do invite anybody, you or others, to offer up suggestions. I would only counsel that, since this is not a brand new question, has had a lot of thought, that please come with something beyond instantaneous, simplistic, oh, let's just get rid of the U.S. government and then everything's okay, because then you only have new problems. You need something that actually solves the set of issues that are underneath that. But speaking for myself personally, I do agree this is an important area, and I have committed a good fraction of the time that I spend in ICANN thinking about this and looking for ways to move forward, and I'm not alone.
Спасибо. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for lunch, and we will continue the conference right after lunch at 1 p.m. exactly. Bon appetit. Lunch